Okay, hello again. This is an Inspector Calls, second video in. We're looking at Mr Birling, and the key question is, or the big question is, how does Priestley use the character of Mr Birling in an Inspector Calls? So we're going to go through four sort of basic ideas here. What ideas does Birling represent? What are some key scenes for this character? And I'm going to focus on about just sort of three parts of the play. There's obviously lots more to it than that, but I'm just going to focus on three things. How does Priestley present this character? And why does Priestley present him in this way? And we'll do this by looking at the actual play script, which you should have a copy of. You can follow along and kind of find the pages in your copy as we do this video if you want to. Okay, let's get straight into it. So what ideas does Birling represent? Don't forget that every character in an Inspector Calls, or pretty much any play that anyone's ever written, aren't real people. They're not real people, they are characters. And they've been made up by the playwright, J.B. Priestley, to do a particular job. Now, so the first question, what ideas does Birling represent? That's an important first question for any character. What do they represent? Well, Birling, he represents capitalism. He represents business. He represents the class of people in Britain at the time who are essentially in charge of society. They're the rich, the wealthy. They run businesses. They employ people, and they've got a lot of power. They have a lot of power in our society today as well. Perhaps even more power. And in 1912, when Inspector Calls is set, they are already very powerful individuals. So Birling is an individual character, yes, but he stands for, symbolizes, or represents capitalism and the business class. Okay, so let's carry on. The first part of Mr. Birling's presentation I want to look at in Inspector Calls is the first part of the play. So at the start of the play, the characters are having a nice dinner. They're celebrating the engagement of Gerald and Sheila, and Mr. Birling steps up to do this big speech, and it goes on for quite a long time, so it's worth looking at in a bit of detail. The first part of it I want to pick up on is highlighted here, and this is, if you're following along, this is on page 4 of your play script. And he says this. It's not the underlined bit, someone was really enthusiastic about that bit, but it's this highlighted bit here. Crofts and Birlings, he's looking forward to a time when Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing but are working together for lower costs and higher prices. So almost the first thing that Mr. Birling says of any importance is he wants lower costs, higher prices. Of course, he's talking in economic terms. He's talking about reducing costs, which means basically not paying people as much. Think of Eva Smith later on. And higher prices, so selling his goods for as high a price as he can get. So not paying people much, but selling his goods for higher prices. And that means he is trying to maximize profit. And again, Mr. Birling, representing capitalism straight away, he's attempting to maximize profit. And that juxtaposition of lower costs and higher prices that Priestley uses shows that idea. He gets further into his speech a little bit further down. He talks about how delighted he is about the engagement, although you might remember that he's kind of more interested in the business side of it really than any lovey-dovey stuff. He calls himself a hard-headed businessman. This is one of those nice double meanings that Priestley drops in. He's hard-headed. To Mr. Birling, he thinks he's really tough and really, he's going to get things done. He's determined, he's tough, all that sort of thing. You might also interpret it, especially in the light of what he says later, is that he's a little bit stupid. But anyway, let's move on, see what he actually says. We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. So there you go. Straight away, again, Priestley showing that Birling is interested in himself, in his own profits, his own wealth and his own riches, and those are the same as the interests of capital or capitalism, and that they should be protected. You might ask yourself, protected from whom? Protected from people like Eva Smith who want to earn more money for a start, but protected from socialism, protected from any kind of attacks that will stop Mr. Birling making his money. And he goes on to talk about things that are happening in the world at the time of the play 1912. The first thing he mentions is that the Germans don't want war. And of course, 1912, you will know from your studies that that's just 2 years before the start of World War One, and that actually here Mr. Birling is completely wrong, because 2 years later the Germans invade Belgium and invade France and start World War One. So, you know, this idea that the Germans don't want war, everyone in Priestley's audience watching in 1945 would have known very, very well that war was on its way at that time. And in fact, in 1945, they will have just lived through the Second World War as well. So this shows that Mr. Birling is dead wrong. We're supposed to, I think Priestley does this because you might make the mistake of thinking that as a businessman, as a successful businessman who's very wealthy, that he should be looked up to, should be admired in some way. But his constant wrong statements tend to undermine that. And this is Priestley using, of course, dramatic irony. Always remember to mention the methods that Priestley is using. Dramatic irony. Everyone in the audience knows that war is coming, but Mr. Birling, of course, doesn't. And even Eric seems to know that there's something going on, because he tries to interrupt and says, you know, what about war? Yes, I know, but still. And he kind of thinks there's something coming. Of course, Eric may well die in the war, sadly. Later on, Mr. Birling talks about the Titanic. This is even worse because, you know, everyone in Priestley's audience would know about the war. Everyone in history knows about the Titanic. The Titanic famously sank in 1912 on the night of April 14th to 15th, sometime in the middle of the night. And there's Mr. Birling saying that it's unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. And again, he's dead wrong. Priestley's using dramatic irony to show how wrong he is. Again, we're not supposed to admire him. We're supposed to think that he's headstrong, but a bit ignorant, a bit stupid. 3 young people, he says, listen to this. In 20 or 30 years' time, let's say in 1940, you may be giving a little party like this, and you'll be, have a look down here, there'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere. And of course, once again, in 1940, if you know your history, that is about the same time that France is invaded by Nazi Germany, and it's about a year after World War II starts. World War II started because Germany invaded Poland, but there was a period when not much fighting was happening, and then by 1940 the real fighting started. Worth knowing about these names, not often talked about very much and not often flagged up, but he says, Mr. Birling, look how much he's talking, by the way. He just won't stop talking. Mrs. Birling tries to interrupt him, but no, he doesn't let her. And he talks about these Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wellses who are doing all the talking. We shouldn't listen to them. Now, Bernard Shaw was a playwright, H.G. Wells was a novelist, and both of them were well-known socialists, and that's the significance there. So Birling setting himself up against socialism, or I should say, Priestley setting Birling up against socialism. Okay, so he said loads of things that are wrong, and that is kind of most of that speech. Towards the end, there's some interesting stuff as well. He talks a lot, keeps on talking, and that's, by the way, a hint about just how much power he's got in society at this time. Think of the character on the stage that hardly talks at all, and she's the person with the least power. That is Edna the maid. You could even argue that Eva isn't even present on the stage, so that she has the least power. But Birling has a lot of power at this point in the play, and so he talks a lot. And look at this. This bit is really a summing up of his whole philosophy and the whole of capitalist philosophy, or quite a big chunk of it. A man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family too, of course, when he has one. So long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. So a man has to make his own way. A man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. So this is the idea that in capitalism, an individual makes their own money for themselves, and it's goes completely against the socialist idea of sharing wealth, sharing resources around. So he also attacks bees in a hive just here. The way some cranks talk, you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive. The simile, like bees in a hive, sounds quite nice, doesn't it? Bees in a hive, working together. I mean, bees are quite nice little things, really. I know everyone in Year 11 is scared of them, but bees in a hive is a positive image, but to Birling it isn't. He doesn't like the idea of community. He doesn't like the idea of bees in a hive working together. He calls it nonsense, all that nonsense. So Priestley is setting Birling up as a thoroughgoing capitalist, a very, very strong, headstrong, determined capitalist who is completely against the socialist idea of people working together and sharing resources and sharing the work and sharing the profits from work and the kind of wealth generated by work. He says this: a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own, and notice the dashes, those dashes that show that he's been cut off in the middle of a sentence. And this is not just the doorbell ringing accidentally, of course, it is the arrival of the inspector, Inspector Gould, who rings the front doorbell. This is a highly symbolic stage direction. So why is Priestley doing this? He's showing that Mr. Birling's point of view is headed for some kind of disruption. He's going to be disrupted and stopped. He's going to be interrupted by the inspector. And as you should know already, the inspector is the mouthpiece of Priestley. He is a socialist voice in this play. So he takes the opposite view to Mr. Birling. Let's go on to the next bit. Okay, so this is page 14 of the play. It's a little bit further on. We'll do a bit on this and we'll do the very end of the play. It's not going to cover, this video won't cover everything about Mr. Birling, but some important moments. So page 14, this is in the middle of where Mr. Birling is talking about Eva Smith and the way he knew her. She worked for him in the factory. She was a good worker, but then, as he says, they decided to ask for more money and started to take industrial action, going on strike, etc., to make more money. Of course, don't forget, he's the guy earlier on who said he wants lower costs and higher prices so he can make more money. But when someone else comes along and wants more money, he doesn't like it. So, but the thing I want to point out about this section is the way the inspector comes along and challenges Birling. So this is very deliberate. Priestley is using the inspector as a character to challenge Birling as a representative of capitalism, of business. So Birling says, look, they wanted the rates raised so they could average about 25 shillings a week. I refused, of course. And the inspector says, why? Birling's surprised. Look at the stage direction. Surprise. Stage direction from Priestley showing he's surprised. Did you say why? Yes, why did you refuse? Well, Inspector, I don't see it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business, is it now? It might be, the inspector says. So the very fact that the inspector asks this question and then Birling is really, really surprised by it, it shows the challenge that the inspector lays down for Birling. He's not going to take this stuff for granted. He's not going to say, yeah, of course, yeah, you should refuse them higher wages. He's going to say, why do you refuse them higher wages? And question that. Okay, so the next part is that I just wanted to flag up. Again, this is just briefly looking at this kind of section, is the use of the word duty here. This is a play that does have some key words in it, and we'll find some as we go along. It's my duty to ask questions, says the inspector, and Birling says, well, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. So notice that they both use the word duty, but their duty is in contradiction to each other. It's in opposition to each other. They are against each other here. So inspector wants to ask questions, but Birling wants to do his thing, keep labour costs down. Why should you ask me why I should do this? And that's the direct kind of power struggle that's going on between these two characters. Birling, he's got the power of being a business leader, a wealthy man, important in British society in 1912. The inspector, he's got that strange, slightly difficult to pin down power of being quite kind of mysterious and almost godlike, and having a kind of socialist attitude to a lot of things, and also being a representative at this point in the play, of course, of the law, being an inspector in the police force. Okay, so that's that bit. Last part of this little section, when Birling comes into conflict with the inspector here. If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth. So he's still arguing that no one should be asking for more money. And Gerald agreeing, I should say so. Inspector says they might, but after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. And of course, this is a criticism of the capitalist Mr Birling. Capitalists don't ask for the earth, they just take it. They take it for themselves, and that's what the inspector is saying there. And that's what Priestley is trying to drop into his speech. All right, on to the very end of the play. Let's have a look. Okay, so towards the end of the play, or right at the end of the play, actually, I should say, this is just the very end. It's Act 3, page 71 of your script. And this is right at the end. At this point, the Birling family, well, Mr Birling and Mrs Birling and Gerald, have decided that everything's fine because it wasn't a real girl and she didn't really exist. And yeah, we all had sort of weird, sort of quite dodgy dealings with different girls, but we can shove that under the carpet, or we can brush that under the carpet, and we can forget about everything and go back to normal. As evidenced by Gerald asking Sheila, what about this ring, which she's a bit kind of skeptical about. He wants her to go back to he wants her to go back to how things were before. But we're focusing on Mr Birling, and I'd just love the way that at this point he is so dismissive of the younger generation, Eric and Sheila specifically, who are by this point in the play more in agreement with the inspector that their behaviour was not good and that they should really be worried about it and feel bad about it and try and make some kind of amends. Whereas the Birling family, or Mr Birling, Mrs Birling, are just kind of, yeah, it's fine. Well, go to bed then and don't stand there being hysterical, Birling says. Mrs Birling says they're overtired. In the morning they'll be as amused as we are. Overtired. Go to bed. Don't stand there being hysterical. These are words and phrases that you might use to little children. So this is very, very kind of infantilizing language being used against Eric and Sheila by Mr and Mrs Birling, making out that they're just children that don't understand. Again, this is a very common kind of idea with capitalist political speech, actually, is to suggest that if you don't really agree with capitalism, then you're probably a bit childish. If you think things should be different, well, that's a bit immature and a bit childish. So that's kind of interesting. But Birling's about to get the shock of his life because, as we know, he's just celebrating the fact that they've got off and they're all fine and it's all going to be good going forward. He's pointing at Eric and Sheila at this point, right at the end of the play. Now look at the pair of them, the famous younger generation who know it all and they can't even take a joke. The younger generation, notice he's pointing out that they think they know it all. And if we remember the first part of the play when Birling was talking as if he knows it all, this is really ironic because he's the person who's setting himself up as knowing it all the most in the whole play. And at that point, he says they can't even take a joke, and then we get that dash again. That dash that shows he's been interrupted, that Priestley sticks in there. It's right in the middle of a sentence. The telephone rings sharply. And of course, this time it's the telephone, the stage directions. Always mention your techniques, always mention the methods. The stage directions, the telephone rings sharply. This is the same as the doorbell ringing at the start of the play to announce the arrival of the inspector. So it's symbolically the same thing. Birling symbolically interrupted by a stage direction, by a sound, which is a kind of warning note saying something is coming to stop him or to interrupt him or to disrupt him or to, attack him in some way. And of course, it's the police on the phone. He goes to answer the phone, and at the very end of the play, that was the police. A girl has just died on her way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant, and a police inspector is on his way here to ask some questions. And all those gaps symbolised, or shown, I should say, by the dashes in the speech, just show how shocked Birling is at the end of the play. Right, so that's Mr Birling. As I said earlier, it's not everything you can know about Birling, but there's quite a lot there to know. And if you know that much about each of the characters in this play, you are going to be fine. So we're going to look at Sheila next. Thank you very much.